There's a metaphor we use a lot in therapy of, scaling a mountain. Sometimes the best way to scale a mountain is to charge onwards. When the conditions are clear, that's the time to make real progress. Sometimes a weather system comes in, and actually the best thing to do is to hunker down, build a shelter, and wait for things to pass.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Now, I've had a lot of conversations recently with climate professionals, young, middle, and old, who have different levels of anxiety. And I've seen plenty of studies recently about how worried people are about the world, about the challenges we face. And on many levels, I wonder, one, is this healthy? Two, is it productive? But three, more than anything, how do we get people to realize, to get beyond the anxiety so that they can focus on the work that they need to do? Through this episode, I'm extremely excited to be joined by one of the leading experts in kind of climate psychology today. Patrick, he holds a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Oxford and is co-director and co-founder of Climate Psychologists, which is an organization whose mission is to move people from climate anxiety to sustainable climate action through what they call their 3 pillars of climate empowerment. And today I just want to talk with him about the work they're doing, understand what is climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, as some would say. What are some of the telltale signs? And then how does he help people move from that anxious, hyped up state into productivity? So, Patrick, welcome to the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time out to join us to talk a little about the work, your insights, your experience. As a starting point, it would be great to have you talk a little about who you are and the challenges that you're focused on solving.
Thank you so much for the invite. As you mentioned as well, I'm a clinical psychologist and did my training here in Oxford. My doctoral research was in trauma in kind of first responders, paramedics, ER doctors, this kind of, what we call kind of vicarious trauma, so the trauma that comes from being exposed to difficult and distressing situations day on day. There was one day someone came to see me who is a climate researcher, and he sat down in my office and he basically described the struggles he was having researching climate change. It was ruining his enjoyment of life, a lot of worry about the evidence he was gathering and what that meant for the future and the uncertainty around it all. I realized I was really passionate about what he was talking about. And I made a sort of, I suppose, a preemptive guess that this problem that he was experiencing was gonna get worse.
If he was patient zero and this is a new field or was a new field at the time, what do you view or how do you define, say, a climate psychologist at this point? Like, what is it that makes you unique, or what is different about the practice or about the individuals that you are either working with, educating, engaging with?
The easiest way of thinking about it is any way in which planetary health and our mental health interact and intersect. But it also, it lends to the conversation around climate communication as well. How do we communicate effectively about what's going on? How to keep people empowered in the context of everything. What makes people distinct about the people, the people that might come to see us or the people we work with? I mean, I think it's fair to say, interestingly, there isn't really anything distinct, other than a concern or a care for what's going on and a realization that it's interacting on their mental health. And when we started off, I think we had an assumption perhaps that we would be working exclusively with sustainability professionals, right? That was what we thought. We're like, these are the people that are going to need this. But within, I don't know, we founded Climate Psychologists in 2018, and within 6 months, it's clear that this problem's bigger than this, and we were being approached by businesses inside and outside the sustainability sector. We've worked in the legal sector, we've worked in the aerospace sector even, we've worked in the oil and gas industry, kind of corners of the world that we really wouldn't find that there would be a need or an appetite for something like us.
Look, I've been in the space for 22 years roughly, right? And what I find interesting about some of these things is we're driven by an intangible concern versus something tangible in our life. Like, we're actually seeing X happen on a day-to-day basis in front of us, right? And we're making these decisions based on something intangible. And in that sense, it can evoke more fear and uncertainty because, we can't really dictate how it's going to happen. But, in a downside economy, when we're running short on cash, we're still having families. We're still growing the families and growing the communities. But if we're worried about the future climate, we're less likely to. And for me, that's kind of like it's confusing for me, but I'm also like, and this is like the rationality of some of these anxieties and how it comes into us. I mean, how do you see that? Because is tangibility something that the more tangible it is, the easier it is for us to process, and therefore we have less anxiety? Is it because there's intangibility, therefore we don't know what's going to happen, so therefore we just stop moving? Like, how does that relationship, kind of tangibility to the issue, and then the likelihood of anxiety coming in? How does that interplay happen?
We did a study in the UK a couple of years ago looking at what some of the drivers for climate anxiety are, and one of the biggest predictors we found was climate information seeking behavior, which we can roughly translate as the more we expose ourselves to, the more we read, the more we come to learn, the more climate anxiety can exist. And you sort of think, well, where does that leave us? Because we've been working really hard, on making the intangible tangible, but almost a byproduct of that process has been people's distress. All of these climate emotions, young climate activists will talk about rage and anger as a key motivator for them. For sure, the shift towards tangibility in terms of weather events and this being much more of a tangible thing in people's lives, I think is affecting those day-to-day decisions, right? In terms of how people live.
Then taking that a bit further, because we're talking a little bit about like the general public versus, say, the advocates, the young advocates that are out there who are using that rage, right? Anxiety as a fuel source to do something, does that lend more towards productivity? And therefore, if you're a sustainability professional, that anxiety is more, say, like a realistic understanding of where the world is headed, and therefore now I know how to do something in my job, or I'm going to engage people differently with more urgency, and therefore I'm feeling more productive. Is that a healthy use versus someone who's sitting in front of the TV watching the world burn and is just sitting there going, my job has nothing to do with this problem? I just feel helpless. Like, do you feel like the same fuel source for one can be a demotivator for another?
This feels like one of the great tragedies of the sustainability world is that, I've worked with organizational teams, or groups of people who I would say probably are having some of the greatest impact. There will be almost a greater sense of sort of inadequacy, kind of a collective inadequacy, right? I mean, sort of
No matter what I do, it doesn't matter.
right. No matter what we do, it doesn't matter. Or
Mhm.
and that just seems so wholly unfair to me. That even amongst the people, perhaps even especially amongst the people who are doing some of the greatest work, right? So because we always when we first founded the organization, we always used to say anxiety to action. That was our tagline, right? If we can just get people from anxiety to action, if people can take action in some form, that'll be enough. And broadly speaking, right, taking some form of action, collective action particularly, right? This is a really important paper that came out last year. Collective action is a much better buffer against climate anxiety than individual action, firstly, right? So when we organize ourselves together, it's obviously much more impactful from a sustainability perspective, but also a much better buffer against some of these things we've talked about, this sense of overwhelm, this sense of frustration. And I think a lot of that is to do with this sort of the collective burden of perfectionism, right? This idea that we have to be doing everything all at once, which of course is unmanageable. I think organizationally sometimes that can hinder progress as well, because there can be a sense of sort of, well, actually this is a step in the right direction, but it's flawed, right? As a policy, right? Say, for example, that fear of the flaws can impact on organizational change.
Yeah, I mean, I'll back up a little bit. I was thinking back, and I was talking with people about this. Like 2009 for me, Copenhagen was probably the most euphoric experience of where the movement went to the masses, where people felt if we solve this, we're hopeful. And around Paris, it turned into if we don't, we're all going to X. And I really thought about how the community has changed quite a bit, where a lot of my friends who I worked with early on in those 2000s, early 2010s, turned into climate quitters. They've kind of given up, or they're mailing it in, or they've gone through a burnout, they're bringing it back. And now the next generation, the younger ones, they're out there more angry than we were before. And I'm wondering, is that because there's a general belief that we are closer to the end, that the problems are getting more tangible, or is that because of just frustration from a lack of progress, even though the base challenges haven't really changed?
Yeah, and I think we there's another actor involved in this, which is this kind of shift towards, shift away from denialism to doomism as a sort of discourse for climate delay. The new climate war, Michael Mann's book, obviously talks a lot about this.
Here's my question around that. I interviewed a good friend of mine who's been in the solar industry for 15 years. We're about to go to a terawatt of solar. We've never seen so much renewables. But yet, if you were to listen to some groups, you'd swear that we haven't put a single panel on a single rooftop anywhere. So how much of this is also just a lack of reflection on how much progress we've made? Is that an important piece of overcoming this anxiety and maintaining focus and maintaining productivity? Is like recognizing the progress that has been made and therefore understanding the actual areas where you need to make more progress.
Another study last year that I think is key in terms of the kind of psychological process that you're describing here. When we ask people, how concerned are you about climate change? 40 odd percent of people say they're very or extremely concerned. If you then ask, how concerned do you think the people around you are? They would estimate only 14% that would say that the people around them are very or extremely concerned. So there's this straight away, you've got this discourse of actually people's beliefs around, not around progress, but around the general level of concern. We know now, as of 2021, we know that the majority of the adult population globally subscribe to the idea that we're facing a climate emergency, even in countries or regions of the world that we would not expect that to be the case. Then when we look outside our windows and we don't see those solar panels that you're describing, or that shift towards renewable energy, this creates what we call the dejection problem. So working on this disconnect, showing people the progress that's being made, but also allowing people to sort of recognize the levels of concern do actually match their own, is an important rallying call, I think.
All right. Someone's suffering from climate anxiety, and I can imagine the next two phases to productivity would be something around the manage and harness. How do you help people get through this? And what are some of the key things they can do, or the key ways that you help them shape their vision or to embrace this and to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned earlier the broad framework, the way that we conceptualize this, which are the kind of three pillars of if you like, climate empowerment, right? The first being awareness. We have to go into this eyes open. Often people with climate anxiety will have quite a high level of awareness in terms of the impacts of the climate crisis. And then the second pillar is well-being. So obviously we have, as psychologists, we have a huge well-being focus. So, and that, oftentimes might involve particularly disengaging from areas of the climate crisis that you have very little personal control over, right? That's not involved in it's not related to your area of work. It might drive this sense of personal inadequacy or lack of action. And then the third pillar is climate action, particularly collective action, like we mentioned, but also sustainable action, right? So people who work in this space deserve to feel joy in their work. They deserve to feel proud of what they're doing. They deserve to be able to reflect, to stop on, a Friday evening, to be able to pause and say, actually, I'm making a difference here. That kind of reflection is surprisingly nebulous. It's surprisingly hard to access. And I think we're not culturally, it's sort of culturally ingrained, particularly in the UK, to be self-effacing about our work. Pride is a deadly sin. It shouldn't be in this context.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because you keep seeing that the problem itself hasn't gotten any smaller, maybe oftentimes. But I just keep coming back down to it. Just feels like a lot of it's just a loss of context and reflection. Like we have made huge strides in education, poverty, healthcare, food and ag. Like we've made a lot of progress. Now, of course, we have some big challenges left to go, but I think we lose face of that because we are so focused on the problem and we're just kind of like a bull seeing red, right? Like we can't see the other colors in the spectrum, but they're there. But at the same time, what I find is also interesting is if you looked at the recent COP or WEF or some of the other ones, the sustainability people go to these events and it's almost like a celebrity show now. It's not as much about the work anymore. It's just about enjoying the community, which I think is very important. The role of community is definitely important, but it's kind of like, it's like there's these two poles and there's nothing in the middle. And I feel like, how do we get people really focused on the work and on the middle and then actually feeling good about the progress they're making?
I think there's a huge amount that organizations can do um, to help create a culture that's a lot more aligned with what you've just described. We're inherently as humans, we're inherently threat focused, and right, that's a survival mechanism. We don't want to lose that. But as a consequence of that, huge amount of context that we're missing. And I'm kind of, I've been accused of being a sort of eternal optimist, and psychologists, we're basically just sort of hope mongers. That's the most literal sort of translation, I think, of our profession. But I think you have to have hope and active hope. And hope is not an emotion, right? Hope is a skill, right? Hope is something that can be trained and learned within organizations, and it's incredibly rallying and motivating and galvanizing.
I think overcoming it is really empowering. And I haven't even mentioned this, but I went through two big burnouts. Went through panic attacks for years. I had heart palpitations for 7 years, ongoing, because of just I don't know, just clamming it all up. And then I realized, I mean, through COVID and a couple other things, I got control of it because I realized like this fear is in many ways, it's irrational because I'm fearing things that I can't control anyway. I can control the work that I do, the people I engage, the systems I build, and I need to be focused really on that and then measuring the progress or trying to figure out where things aren't going well and addressing those tangible things to me versus the polar bear that's looking for the last ice cube. And by doing that, I actually started to strip away like the emotion from what I'm looking at. Like the color red started to come down, my blood pressure came down, and then I could realize like this is how I can make progress. And I found that when you get to that point, it really does help a lot in terms of how you engage with people, how you engage with your work, and then how you kind of, over time just drop that anxiety that I'm not going to save the world, right? Like I wish I could, I'm not, but also I'm going to work on what I can and feel really good about that and feel empowered about that. And that I think is really powerful.
Yeah, that's such a great that's such a great personal example, and one of the most important projects I've been aware of in the climate science community was something called "Is This How You Feel?" A guy called Joe Rogan in Australia, who just had climate scientists just write these handwritten letters to him expressing how they're feeling, right, about things. And it opened up this conversation, right? It's like, well, God, you're feeling that way as well, and it created a space for these conversations to happen. And now I think the climate science community has engaged, it's now normalized this way of viewing things. And my hope is that this continues to grow.
All right, one last question. You want to open up this space? What are 3 tips that someone suffering from climate anxiety can deploy right now to find a little bit of peace of mind?
Number one, accept that it's, remind yourself, encourage yourself with the fact that it's normal. Find a community of people. There's been this huge proliferation of climate cafes and other forums for people to be able to discuss openly how they're feeling. Take some form of sustainable action for yourself, right? And that might kind of seemingly paradoxically, that might be giving yourself a week off, right? Just like downing tools for a while. There's a metaphor we use a lot in therapy of, scaling a mountain. And sometimes the best way to scale a mountain is to charge onwards, right? When the conditions are clear, that's the time to make real progress. Sometimes the weather system comes in, and actually the best thing to do is to hunker down, build a shelter and wait for things to pass.